What an amazing session we've just had. Like somebody else said, I've been furiously writing notes there because this is a real opportunity, I think. And so what I want to think about now is something called 5 Ways to Wellbeing, because we want to build back something a bit better. So my name is Anne-Marie Gawen, and I have my own small training company called Unlock Your Wellbeing. Hang on. So, as we say, it's an opportunity to do things differently. And actually, people often talk about, oh, yes, our employees are our most important asset, etc. Not always, you wouldn't realise that from how they treat them. But actually, it's the well-being. You can have all the most amazing employees in the world. If their well-being's not good, that it's not a good asset to have. And you can have precious few whose well-being is great. We also know that staff retention is really important. It costs a fortune. It's a real drag on businesses having to replace staff frequently. And also we want to be a magnet employer where people have heard, oh, do you know what? They don't have to look after your well-being good at that place. You know, that's a place I'd like to work at. So getting that reputation, being a magnet employer. And you might think, well, you know, why would I even get bothered about all of this? But actually, it's a really good thing to do because when we think about return on investment from wellbeing initiatives, Deloitte, who published their report at the beginning of this year, show that for every £1 invested in wellbeing and mental health initiatives, you get a £5 return on investment. Because it leads to greater motivation and productivity, as many people intimated earlier. Now, I just saw this morning, so this is hot off the press. So this is a quote from Sir Ian Cheshire, who's the chairman of Barclays UK, and this is brilliant. Don't waste a good crisis. Make sure mental health and well-being are built into your recovery plans. And I'm going to be posting this far and wide today because this is just so important. It's a lot of what we were talking about earlier. Never mind going back to the old normal, you know, maybe this new normal we can create in a better way. So, and the reason that we do that is where we know the evidence shows us quite clearly that where there is a culture in that workplace where it's okay, it's even encouraged that we talk about our well-being and our mental health, that leads to increased happiness, motivation and productivity of the workforce. And sadly, on the other side of that, we also know that where you're not able to talk about well-being and mental health, that we have a lot of poor staff morale there, productivity is lower, higher levels of absenteeism and turnover of staff. So all of these are indicative that there's something about the culture there that's not right. So what if there were evidence-based actions that we could incorporate into the workplace? Because a lot of people have great intentions, but then think, yeah, but how do I do it? So this is going to be a really practical session for you because there are, thank goodness there are. And they are called 5 Ways to Wellbeing. So I think it was a number of years ago, say 8 years ago, the government gave the New Economics Foundation the task of going away and coming back with evidence-based actions that they could say to the population as a whole, what is going to help your well-being? They were very much aware that they put out a lot of messages around physical health and physical well-being, but noticed that emotional and mental well-being was being a little bit ignored. And so they did a meta-analysis of all the research and the evidence nationally, internationally, etc., and came up with what's now known as 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And they are, dun, 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 here we go. So they are connect. And we were very much talking about our connections earlier today, how those relationships, our relationships are so important. So that's not a big surprise. We are social animals. The next one was be active. And you are probably aware that that's really good for us, all those lovely endorphins that we get the benefit from. Keep learning was another one. Sometimes people are a bit surprised about this one, but I call it, instead of calling it learning, because sometimes people associate it with formal education and maybe they weren't very good at that. So I now call it lifelong curiosity. And I just think that makes it sound a bit more appealing. Give was also found to be really important, and notice. So those are the 5 ways to well-being. So we can absolutely transfer these into the workplace. And I've worked with workplaces where they have, for instance, used these 5 ways to well-being as when they've had staff meetings. These have been the headings instead of your usual ones like update from, this analysis and that and all the rest of it. These have actually been the headings. So being really creative, like this, you can do it. They've also been they've been the headings in people's newsletters, for instance. So if there's a weekly, monthly newsletter that goes out, these are the headings. So they are absolutely saying we are taking your well-being seriously. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into each one of those a little bit more, and then I'm going to give you the opportunity to either tell us something great that you do in your organisation, or alternatively, as you're listening and thinking, maybe you're getting some ideas and being inspired to think, oh, we could do this in our workplace. I think that would be a good idea. So hopefully it's going to be inspiring, but it's also a way of sharing good practice. So the first one, as we say, was connect for mental well-being. And these relationships really matter, whether they're with our family, our friends, and our colleagues. So if we were thinking about connecting the workplace, what might we be thinking about? Well, this is a question for you. Are you a good colleague, and how do you show it? Do you know your other colleagues? I remember working with somebody a few years ago now. He worked at the university, and he said, what I've noticed over the weeks when we were working together is I'm not a very good colleague. I've worked there for many, many years, and I go in and I say, hello, how are you? And put my head down and get on with my work. He said, I started deliberately trying to be a better colleague and talking to people after a number of weeks of we been working together. And he said it has really paid dividends. And he said, and I now actually feel quite ashamed of what a bad colleague I was. And it hadn't even entered my thought processes. So think about, in what way are you a good colleague? The person's behaviour that you can change is your own. You might want to lead by example and therefore encourage other people to change, but are you a good colleague? In your workplace, if there is any conflict, interpersonal conflict, how is it dealt with? Many people will just brush it under the carpet. Sometimes there's, bullying culture. Sometimes management style is encouraged to be rather brutal in some industries. And so what would you say to one of your employees who said, well, I've changed managers recently and I was really loving my job, and now this new manager has come along and, I'm sorry, but their style really upsets me in whatever way. How is that handled in your workplace? So facing these things. And in terms of connection and communication, do you have that two-way communication? What ways do people have of connecting and communicating? Quite often one-to-ones, which are absolutely essential in many industries. The work becomes really busy, and so people say, oh, can we miss the one-to-one this week? We'll do it next week. Those are kind of the first things to go. So thinking about the way that we connect and communicate is really important. So is there anything that you do or things what could you do that you don't currently do? Is there something around that or is there something that you do that's a really good idea? So hold on to that thought, because we want to share. So what about being active? Because we know that physical activity is both good for our mental and our physical well-being. Quite often if you've got a really tangly thought, or you're sort of going round and round in circles, taking yourself off for a good walk or run or whatever it is that you like to do, you can at least untangle your thoughts, if not come up with a solution. It can be really impactful. So what can we do in the workplace? So what about things like encouraging movement? Sometimes bringing an element of competition can be quite useful. You know, let's have this team against that team, or this department against that department, and let's see how many steps we can all do, and we can try and outdo each other in our step challenges, encouraging people to use the stairs rather than the lifts, you know, by, you know, like putting stickers in the lift saying, do you really need to use the lift, or whatever. Can you arrange lunchtime walks? Depending on where your business is, that, you know, that can be quite a nice thing to do if you've got an area that you can walk in. Do you encourage people to cycle to work? Do you have a cycle to work scheme? And maybe also alongside that, because a lot of people say, well, I would cycle to work, but, you know, I need to change when I get there and there's not a shower or a changing room. You know, so that might be something to consider. Are there any team sports groups there, whether it's a running group or a netball team, etc.? Thinking also about walking meetings, and I know these are becoming more common now, but you know, maybe incorporating them a little bit more. So these can be walking internally or externally. Thinking also about stand-up desks. These can be jolly useful for people. At the moment, I don't think you can buy them for love nor money, because everybody's bought all of their equipment for home working. But stand-up desks can be very beneficial for the musculoskeletal systems. And think like there's an organisation I work with who's decided every Friday you don't send a colleague an email, you walk around to them and have a discussion, and then you walk back. And if anything needs noting down, then you can send an email. But on a Friday, you walk to people's desks. So it's just introducing that activity, really. Okay, so is there anything else that you do that you'd like to do? So have a little think about that. So what about keep learning, or as I say, lifelong curiosity? What this does, if we are open to and curious about the world, if we like to learn and are encouraged to do so, any new skill that we learn, it just helps us in terms of our self-confidence and our self-esteem. And it also gives us more of a sense of purpose. You might think, oh my goodness, I can now speak a little bit of Spanish, you know. That might come in handy somewhere if you've learned a language, for instance. But, you know, keep learning in its very broadest sense. So how can we put this in the workplace? Well, training is really important, and formal training budgets have been slashed, because I am a trainer and I approach organisations and they tell me this. But often that training is so important in making sure that people do have the skills to do their job, to refresh their skills, especially if they've not used them for a while, all of those kind of things. That is really important. And doing that training needs analysis with people really could be key. But then, of course, there are less formal types of training. You know, you might have skills to share, you know, you might do the trickle down, you know, you've learned, and then you will teach the people lower down the stream, the new, how to do things. Things like having a buddy or a mentor, sharing things like TED Talks that you found particularly useful maybe, or anything really, you know, any articles or programs on the TV, that kind of thing, that you found useful that your colleagues might enjoy. So keeping that really as open as possible. So again, thinking about what can you do that you don't currently do right now? Is there something there? And then the next one is give. So we know also that large or small acts of kindness really improve our well-being. There's a phrase that says, doing good does you good. You actually savour and remember doing something good for something far more than if somebody gives you an act of kindness. So that stays with you, makes you happier and more satisfied with life. So how might that be in the workplace? Well, you might have every year, you might have a charity of the year that you support, and do lots of events around that. And really making sure that that's as inclusive as possible, because there'll be some people that can do the running, you know, if you're doing running for a charity. There'll be some people who can bake or something like that, and there'll be other people who are really just great at getting people together. So playing to each other's strengths so that everybody can be involved in that. Maybe you sponsor a local community event. Maybe also you've got skills or knowledge that would be really great to share with local community groups or schools. And I know a lot of businesses link like that. Maybe have some open days and invite the local community in as well. But also thinking at a lower level than that, kind of thinking about, giving compliments and rewarding exceptional work. How do you do that? It doesn't have to cost you very much at all. I worked with an organisation, and I think they came up with a brilliant idea. I can't remember if it was every week. I think it was every week. They had kind of an employee, a kind of employee, a wellbeing employee of the week or whatever. So it wasn't really necessarily about their work things that they had to meet. It was something that they'd done in the wellbeing sphere. So it could have been many, many things. So this is showing that we can reward things other than meeting targets. And what that person got for the next week was the best parking space. And so they had a parking space that was all marked out for, this employee of the week. And people were really keen. That was a real incentive. So how will you incentivize this? But it doesn't always have to be. It can just be noticing good practice in the wellbeing arena. So what do? You might have some great things that you do there, but also thinking about what could you do. And the final one was notice. So notice what's going on in the world. We really need to slow down and smell the coffee or the roses, whatever you prefer. And it's really good for our well-being. And I know other speakers are going to be talking further on about things like mindfulness. But taking the time and putting things into action and using our breath as the very first thing that we can do to help us to stay calm and to slow down. So in the workplace, how could you do that? Some workplaces do start meetings with a collective, very brief breathing exercise, or going around and asking people how they were, but listening. And a lot of the training that I do around mental health and noticing what's going on for somebody and early warning signs, etc., is around change. So there's no point in me saying to somebody, you've got to notice a change in your colleague, and then you might be thinking, I'll approach them and ask them if everything's all right, if you don't know what their normal is. So getting to know your colleague so you know what their normal is, so that you know if it does change, that might need, something, an intervention or a conversation or just how are things, etc. Some organisations provide this particular app, Headspace. It is more of a paid-for one. It's free for so long and then you have to pay for it. That's often provided, but there are many, many other similar apps as well. So what do you do in this area? And is there something that you could do? So I'm not being prescriptive here. What I want to just to think about is that there is this structure. There is this 5 ways to well-being. There are some guidances for you to think about what could we do. So what do you think? What I'd like you to do is share your thoughts, ideas, good practice that you already do, or maybe think about, maybe a light bulb moment has happened and you thought, oh, we could do this in our workplace around these 5 ways to well-being. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to put you into groups, okay, so you can have a little chat amongst yourselves. Please nominate one person who's going to come back and feedback what you've been talking about. And this is an opportunity for you to share good practice, as I say, or come up with ideas, which often helps when you've got a sounding board with somebody else there.